This last video of Chapter 3 will take us through the lobes of the cerebral cortex. So as we saw in the last video, the cerebral cortex has a very specific organization to it. We saw the 6 distinct laminae that it has that are parallel to the surface of the cortex, and the columns that run perpendicular to those laminae. It is also divided into 4 lobes: the occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal, and we'll go through each one of these. Now please continue on with part 2 of the brain anatomy handout as we go through each one of these lobes of the cortex. So again, just to show you that this fissure here separates us into a right hemisphere and a front hemisphere. This is the front of the brain with the frontal lobe, and back here is the occipital lobe. I'm going to show it to you here in another diagram, which I think is a little bit better. So if you were to put your hand flat on your forehead, that's going to be about here, and that's where we are. And behind your hand, then inside your brain, this is where the frontal lobe would be. Now, if you were to put your hand on the back of your head, that would be right about here, and behind that, then you would see your occipital lobe, just to orientate ourselves a little bit to where we are. So again, we're going to start here back in the occipital lobe. So again, if you put your hand on the back of your head, just above your neck, that's going to be where that occipital lobe is. So the occipital lobe, we see here that it says it contains the visual cortex. So it contains the primary visual cortex, which as it sounds is important in processing visual information. So information is going to come in from our eyes that are in the front of our head, and those light waves are going to hit retina and hit photoreceptors in the retina in the back of our so light waves are going to come and hit photoreceptors in the back of our retina, and then that information is going to travel along the optic nerve back to the visual cortex. Now, of course, remember we said that information, that incoming sensory information, has to relay somewhere. Do you remember where that was? What was that gatekeeper or that traffic director that's located in the center of the brain? What was that called? The thalamus. So that incoming visual information relays in the thalamus before going back to that visual cortex. Now, damage to this visual cortex can result in what's called cortical blindness. So this is where the individual can't see anything because this visual cortex has been damaged, but they have a normal pupil response. So those light waves come in and hit the back of the retina, those photoreceptors respond, the pupil responds, there's nothing wrong in the eye. That information travels back on the optic nerve to the visual cortex, but the cells in the visual cortex, because they've been damaged, can't respond to that incoming sensory information. So that's called cortical blindness. The parietal lobe, now if you put your hands up, not to the front of your head, but kind of in the middle and back, and put your hands up so that your fingers are touching, that's where your parietal lobe is. So your right hand, under your right hand would be your right parietal lobe, under your left hand, your left parietal lobe. And it contains the primary somatosensory cortex, or the postcentral gyrus. So remember, we had this central sulcus here, and this central sulcus, behind it, has the postcentral gyrus. So the central sulcus is that valley, the postcentral gyrus, so after the gyrus, after that central sulcus, is also known as the somatosensory cortex. So that somatosensory cortex is going to process all that incoming information about our sensation of touch. So if someone touches you on your right arm, pressure receptors in that skin are going to bring that incoming sensory information along that sensory nerve to those neurons that are in those dorsal root ganglion, take that further into the spinal cord, and send that signal up to the brain, to the somatosensory cortex. And of course, it's going, if you got touched on the right side of your body, it's going to go to the left somatosensory cortex, or the contralateral side. If you get touched on the left side of your body, it's going to go to the right somatosensory cortex because it goes to the contralateral side. The somatosensory cortex also receives information from muscle and stress receptors and joint receptors. So the interesting thing about both the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex is something called somatotopy. So let's think about the cells, or the receptors in your finger that are important for your sensation of touch in the finger. When those receptors send information to that sensory neuron, that continues on up into the brain to the somatosensory cortex, the neurons that are responding to that sensation of touch in your finger in the somatosensory cortex have neurons in the adjacent motor cortex that are going to control movement in that same part of the finger. And so that's part of that idea of somatotopy. The other idea is that areas that are more sensitive to touch, like your mouth, take up a bigger volume of the somatosensory cortex. So they're going to have bigger volume means more neurons to respond to that sensation of touch. So places like your mouth or your hand. So compare your hand and the surface area of your hand to the trunk. Now, this area, the trunk is much bigger, going from our shoulders down to our waist, but yet, because it's not very sensitive to touch, it doesn't take up a very big volume of neurons in the somatosensory cortex. And you can see this is the motor cortex responding. And you can see how, again, very similar areas in adjacent cortical areas. And then again, things that require more complex movement, like your fingers or your mouth, take up much more, a much bigger volume of neurons in the motor cortex than areas like the trunk or the shoulders that don't really require much intricate movement. So the parietal lobe also has some other functions. It monitors information about the eye, the head, and body positions. It's also essential for spatial information as well as numerical information. So things like, think about like when you count on using your fingers. That's overlap of both spatial and numerical tasks. In addition, things that aren't listed here, things like problem solving. So Albert Einstein, one of the things that I've read that they found about him was that he had a larger parietal lobe than the average person, suggesting that the parietal lobe would be important in problem solving. Now the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe, think by the temples of your head, kind of down, like if you put your hands on the side of your head from your temples down to your ears, underneath there, that's where your temporal lobes would be. So this is the temporal lobe here. And the temporal lobe here you see contains what's called the auditory cortex. So the auditory cortex is important in hearing. And we already saw the visual cortex and the somatosensory cortex. And so on that handout, when I ask you what cortical region is important for example, hearing, the cortical region important for hearing would be that auditory cortex. So again, in the occipital lobe, the cortical region important in vision would be that visual cortex, and so on and so forth. So the auditory cortex, important in hearing, again, situated nice and, nice on the sides of your heads, right near those ears, which is very convenient. So auditory information is going to come in, hit hair cells in those ears, and then send that information along an auditory nerve to that auditory cortex. But of course, where does it have to relay first before going to that auditory cortex? What's the gatekeeper called? The traffic director? The thalamus. And in the left hemisphere, and here we're seeing the left hemisphere, in the left hemisphere we have something called Wernicke's area. Yes, it starts with a W, but it's pronounced Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is important in understanding language or language comprehension. And the way I remember that it's Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, because we're going to have another area called Broca's area that we're going to talk about in a little bit, is that in order to understand language, we have to hear it. So it's situated nice and close to the auditory cortex because that's going to process our sensation of hearing. And so the Wernicke's area is the temporal lobe, where we have the auditory cortex to help us understand language. Some other jobs, the temporal lobe, it's important in complex aspects of vision, movement and perception, emotional and motivational behaviors, and memory. So if you were to peel back this temporal lobe, underneath there, within that temporal lobe, you're going to see that amygdala that we talked about and the hippocampus. So remember we said the amygdala important in emotional behavior, emotional responses, and the hippocampus being important in the formation of those new memories. The frontal lobe, so again, if you take your hands and you put them on the front of your head, underneath those would be that frontal lobe. And it's going to contain the primary motor cortex or the precentral gyrus. So here's that motor cortex, and again, remember that central sulcus, and before that is a gyrus. It's called the precentral gyrus. And the motor cortex, like it sounds, is going to have motor neurons that issue orders to the muscles via the motor neurons in the spinal cord. So it's going to issue the orders that tell those muscles what to do. Now, the motor cortex doesn't plan the movement. We'll see when we talk about movement later on that there's many other areas. But one thing the motor cortex does when it sends those projections down into that spinal cord, it sends a copy to the cerebellum, because remember we said the cerebellum was important in coordinating those movements and with balance and timing and rhythm and things like that. So the primary motor cortex issues orders to the muscles. Other areas are going to plan that movement. Now, in the frontal lobe, we also have Broca's area that you see here. So again, this is in the left hemisphere. And Broca's area is important in language production. So again, the way I remember that Broca's area is in the frontal lobe is because we also have the primary motor cortex. And in order to produce language, we need to move all those muscles in our mouth and our tongue and our vocal cords. And so it's nice and close here to that primary motor cortex to allow that. So, and Broca's area also is in the left hemisphere. So note we saw Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, Broca's area is in the left hemisphere, suggesting that what hemisphere is important in language? The left hemisphere. Language, in most people, occurs in the left hemisphere. Now, we also have the prefrontal cortex. So this prefrontal cortex is going to be the most anterior portion of the frontal lobe. And I'm going to show you that here on this slide. So here you can see in humans it takes up a huge percentage of our cortical volume. And you can also see that it's much bigger than it is in other species. And it's one of the things that we think makes us uniquely human, is having this large prefrontal cortex. So we know it's an integration center. It integrates sensory information from other regions of the cortex. Also responsible for other higher functions, things like abstract thinking and planning. Now, you don't normally see other species doing abstract thinking, thinking of things that they haven't experienced, or planning out their day. Making decisions, so weighing the pros and cons of things, being able to figure out what's the right thing to do. When that's impaired or isn't fully developed, we see impulse control or impulse problems. Also known to be involved in attention and working memory. And so the prefrontal cortex is one of those areas that develops well into adulthood. And so in adolescence, it's not fully developed. So that might be why you see them making some poor decisions or not having proper impulse control. We see a burst of activity and development in the prefrontal cortex around the age of 3 or 4, when you see children being able to kind of start to wait for things that they really want and understand they can't always have what they want. And then again in adolescence and into adulthood. In terms of working memory, some evidence suggests it's involved in working memory and being able to retrieve information from long-term memory to help us actively process something, is that in older individuals, their working memory is impaired, and we also see deficiencies in that prefrontal cortex. So now we've taken our tour through the brain. I hope you've finished that handout. Go back, make some flashcards, study. Anatomy really needs a lot of repetition.